It was the mid-1950s, and America felt pretty good about itself. The war was over. People had jobs. They built new homes. Families grew. But then a sound came, a rhythm. And a young man with a guitar, he moved his body. And he sang, and a lot of people lost their minds, but not everyone. Many loved him, but many more were scared. Really scared. What was it about Elvis Presley that caused such a stir? Why did adults, parents, preachers, and politicians see him as a threat? Was it the music? Is his looks, his moves, or was it something deeper? Something about America itself? What were they truly afraid of? Was it their kids? Or themselves? These questions still hang in the air. We still wonder about them. What does that tell us about our own fears today? Number 18. What was America afraid of before Elvis even sang a note? In America in the 1950s seemed calm. On the surface it was. People talked about prosperity. They talked about traditional values, family was central, church was important, men worked, women stayed home. This was the ideal. But beneath that calm, things were shifting fast. World War II had ended. It changed everything. Soldiers came home. They wanted a normal life. They built suburbs. They had lots of kids. The baby boom was real, but the war also opened up the world. It showed people different ways of living. It sped up technology. TV was new. Rock and roll was new. It wasn't just Elvis. Things like comic books were already under attack. Dr. Frederick Wertham's book, Seduction of the Innocent, published in 1954, scared parents. It said comic books turned kids into delinquents. It fueled a panic. Juvenile delinquency was a big fear. People worried about teenagers. They worried about youth culture. This was before Elvis even hit big. The ground was already fertile for a moral panic. People were looking for something to blame, for the changes they felt but couldn't name. The Cold War added to this. There was a fear of internal threats, of things corrupting American values, things that could weaken the nation from within. This created a climate of suspicion. Anything that felt new or different could be seen as dangerous. And then Elvis arrived. He was very new. He was very different. He stepped right into this anxious time. He became the symbol of everything people feared, about change, about youth, about what might be lost. What truly shocked people about their own desires in this supposedly calm decade was the fear of Elvis just a cover for deeper anxieties about America's future, and how much of that 1950s calm was actually a forced suppression of growing social tensions. Number 17, was it just his wiggling hips that caused all the trouble? Elvis Presley moved his body in a way no one on mainstream TV had ever seen. He twisted, he gyrated, his legs shook, his hips swiveled. This was the pelvis, as he became known. The Ed Sullivan Show, a huge Sunday night TV program, famously showed him only from the waist up. This happened in 1957. It was an attempt to censor his moves, to keep him clean for family viewing. But it was too late. People knew, they saw him on other shows, like the Milton Berle Show in 1956. His performance of Hound Dog there was electrifying and scandalous. His movements were called vulgar, animalistic, suggestive. Dr. Joyce Brothers, a well-known psychologist, even wrote about it. She talked about the primal, almost sexual energy he put out. For many adults, this was too much. It crossed the line. It wasn't polite. It wasn't what young men were supposed to do, especially not on national television. They saw it as an open display of sexuality. It challenged all the norms of public decency. But for teenagers, especially girls, it was exciting. It was rebellious. It spoke to something inside them, something that polite society tried to keep hidden. His movements weren't just dance steps, they were a statement. They broke rules. They defied authority. They made people uncomfortable. That discomfort quickly turned to anger, and then to fear. Did the adults truly not understand what his movements meant, or were they just angry their children did? If Elvis had just sung and stood still, would the panic have been the same? And what does it say about a society when a simple body movement can spark such outrage? Number 16, how did race play a hidden role in the Elvis panic? Elvis Presley was white, but his music was black. He took rhythm and blues. He took gospel. He took country. He mixed them. He made something new, rock and roll. But the roots were clear. Many white teenagers in the 1950s had never heard music like this. Or they heard it on race radio stations. Those were stations aimed at black audiences. White artists like Pat Boone sang cleaned up versions of black songs. They made them acceptable. Elvis didn't clean them up. He brought the raw energy of black music to white audiences. This caused a problem for some. America was still very segregated. Jim Crow laws were in full force in the South. The civil rights movement was just starting. The Supreme Court's Brown v. Board of Education decision came in 1954. It said segregated schools were illegal. This was a huge shift. Many white people resisted it. They feared mixing. They feared black culture affecting white culture. Elvis became a symbol of this fear. He brought black music into white homes. He made white teenagers dance like black performers. Critics often described his music and movements using racialized terms. They called it jungle music. They called it primitive. These words carried racist undertones. They suggested something wild, something uncivilized. They were code words. They reflected deeper anxieties about race relations, about social change, about who controlled culture. Many people felt Elvis was a white boy acting black. This was seen as a threat. It blurred lines. It challenged the rigid racial hierarchy of the time. Were parents more afraid of the music itself or the racial mixing it represented? How much of the moral panic was actually a disguised racial panic? And if Elvis had been black, would he have even been allowed on national television at all? Number 15. Why was teenage sexuality such a taboo topic? The 1950s were a time of strict sexual norms, especially for teenagers. Girls were expected to be pure. Boys were expected to be respectful. Sex was something for marriage, and it wasn't talked about. Not openly anyway, but teenagers were still teenagers. They felt desires, they explored feelings. Elvis tapped directly into this. His music was sensual, his voice was suggestive. His looks were overtly sexual. This was a shock to the adult world. They saw him as corrupting their children, especially their daughters. Girls screamed at his concerts. They fainted. They cried. This emotional display was seen as hysteria, as out of control. Adults interpreted it as sexual arousal, and they blamed Elvis. They saw him as awakening inappropriate desires in young people. Life magazine, a popular publication, even ran features on the Elvis epidemic. They questioned the sanity of his young female fans. Psychologist Dr. Louis Berg wrote an article in Coronet magazine in 1957. He called rock and roll a communicable disease. He linked it to juvenile delinquency and sexual promiscuity. He said it caused a neurotic symptom. The panic wasn't just about his moves. It was about what those moves represented. It was about the unspoken but powerful force of teenage sexuality. A force adults felt they needed to control, to contain. Elvis unleashed it. Or at least he gave it a voice and a body. And that was terrifying to many. Were adults more afraid of Elvis's sexuality or the open expression of their children's? What hidden desires in the adult world did Elvis accidentally expose through this panic? And how did society expect young people to learn about their own bodies without any public conversation? Number 14, were parents really afraid of Elvis or losing control of their kids? Their parents in the 1950s had a specific idea of how children should be raised. Respectful, obedient, conformist. They lived through a depression and a war. They wanted stability for their kids. They wanted a better life, a predictable life. But their kids, the baby boomers, were different. They grew up with more money, more leisure time, more access to media. They had their own culture, their own music. Elvis was the king of this new youth culture. He was a symbol of it. When kids loved Elvis, parents felt a disconnect. They didn't understand him. They didn't understand the music. This made them feel powerless. They felt they were losing control, not just over what their children listened to, but over their values, their behavior, their future. Dr. Benjamin Spock, the famous pediatrician, was a voice of parental authority. Even though his books were progressive for the time, they still emphasized parental guidance and structure. The fear wasn't just that Elvis was bad, it was that he offered an alternative authority. He offered a path that was separate from the one parents envisioned. They saw their children drifting away into a world they didn't recognize, a world where a gyrating singer could command more loyalty than traditional figures. This fear of losing authority was deeply unsettling. It created a generational divide, a real chasm, and Elvis stood right in the middle of it. Did parents secretly envy the freedom Elvis represented for their children? If parents had embraced Elvis, would the panic have fizzled out quicker? And how much of the parental fear was really about their own failed dreams being mirrored in their children's rebellion? Number 13, how did the media fan the flames of the moral panic? In newspapers, magazines, and early television, played a huge role in the Elvis panic. They didn't just report the news, they shaped it, they amplified it. They often took a moral stance. Magazines like Life, Time, and Look featured Elvis, but their tone was often critical, or at least sensationalist. They focused on the hysteria of his fans. They highlighted the outrage of adults. They used words like controversial, primitive, and alarming. Local newspapers were even harsher. They published letters from angry parents. They ran editorials condemning rock and roll. Columnists wrote pieces about the decline of youth, about the dangers of this new music. TV variety shows, while giving Elvis a platform, also struggled with how to present him. Ed Sullivan's Waist Up rule is a prime example. It was a compromise, an attempt to sanitize him for the masses. But it also drew more attention to his controversial movements. Radio stations sometimes banned his songs, or they played them with warnings. The media created a feedback loop. They reported the panic. That reporting fueled more panic. It made the issue seem bigger than it was. It validated the fears of many adults. It gave a public voice to the outrage. It created a common enemy, Elvis. The media, consciously or not, helped build the narrative that Elvis was a dangerous force, a threat to society. Did the media truly believe Elvis was a danger, or did they just recognize a profitable story? If there was no television, would the panic have spread as widely or quickly? And how much of public opinion is truly organic versus shaped by what we read and see in the news? Number 12, what did religious leaders say about the king of rock and roll? Religious institutions, particularly conservative Christian groups, were very vocal during the Elvis panic. They saw him as a symbol of moral decay. They preached against rock and roll from their pulpits. They called it the devil's music. Pastors and priests warned their congregations. They said Elvis's music and dancing encouraged sin. They said it promoted lust. They called it vulgar. They feared for the souls of young people. Many religious leaders saw a direct link between rock and roll and juvenile delinquency. They believed it was leading youth astray, away from God, away from the church. Reverend Bob Mize, a Baptist minister in the South, was one of many who publicly condemned Elvis. He organized record burnings. This wasn't uncommon. People gathered, they threw Elvis records onto bonfires. They felt they were purifying their communities, they were fighting evil. These acts were powerful symbols. They showed how deeply many people felt about the issue. They believed they were protecting their children. They believed they were upholding sacred values. For them, Elvis was more than just a singer. He was a spiritual threat. He challenged the moral foundation of their faith. He challenged their God-given authority. This religious condemnation added a very serious layer to the panic. It made it about eternal salvation, not just about teenage fun. Did religious leaders truly believe Elvis was evil, or were they just trying to maintain their own power over their congregations? How much of this religious panic was a genuine spiritual concern, and how much was fear of cultural change? And what does it mean when a performer becomes a target of spiritual warfare? Number 11 were psychologists and sociologists helping or hurting the situation. In the 1950s, psychology and sociology were trying to understand society. When Elvis emerged, some tried to analyze the phenomenon. Others just echoed public fears. As mentioned, Dr. Louis Berg called rock and roll a communicable disease. He said it caused a neurotic symptom. He wasn't alone. Many mental health professionals tried to explain the hysteria of young fans. They often pathologized it. They described it as a mass psychological phenomenon, or they linked it to a lack of parental guidance or to a search for identity in a confusing world. But they rarely challenged the idea that Elvis himself was a negative influence. Instead, they often reinforced it. They gave scientific-sounding language to the moral panic. They provided expert opinions that validated adult fears. For example, some psychologists suggested that the strong reactions of girls were due to unresolved Oedipal complexes. This put the blame back on the girls themselves or their families, not on the music or the artist. Sociologists, meanwhile, explored the idea of juvenile delinquency. They connected rock and roll to deviant behavior. They studied youth gangs. They looked at the breakdown of traditional social structures. Elvis and rock and roll fit neatly into these discussions. They became convenient examples. They were seen as drivers of social decay. These academic opinions lent credibility to the moral panic. They made it seem rational, scientific, even when the evidence was often anecdotal or biased. Did these experts genuinely seek to understand, or were they simply reflecting the biases of their time? How much did their scientific explanations serve to justify adult control over youth culture? And if a similar phenomenon happened today, would our current experts approach it with more open minds or fall into similar traps? Number 10. Did politicians really care about Elvis or just scoring points? Politicians, like other authority figures, weighed in on the Elvis panic. They saw an opportunity to appeal to concerned parents, to show they cared about moral values, to seem strong on law and order. In some cities, mayors and police chiefs banned Elvis performances, or they put strict rules on them. For example, in Jacksonville, Florida, in 1956, a judge threatened to arrest Elvis if he performed his controversial moves. But Elvis had to stand still. He just wiggled his finger. This was seen as a small act of rebellion, but it showed the pressure politicians often linked rock and roll to juvenile delinquency. Senator Estes Kefauver was famous for his investigations into organized crime. But he also touched on the dangers of popular culture. He implied that such music could lead to social problems. These political statements added to the official condemnation of Elvis. They suggested that the government itself saw him as a problem. This was not always about genuine concern. It was often about votes, about public image, about showing leadership on moral issues. For some, it was a way to distract from other, more pressing, social problems. By focusing on a perceived threat to youth, they could avoid harder conversations. Conversations about poverty, about racial injustice, about economic inequality. Elvis was an easy target, a convenient scapegoat. Were these politicians truly worried about Elvis, or just about their approval ratings? If a politician had publicly supported Elvis, how would their career have changed? And how often do political figures use cultural threats to divert attention from real societal issues? Number 9. How did Elvis get blamed for juvenile delinquency? The 1950s saw a growing concern about juvenile delinquency. This was a broad term. It covered everything from petty crime to rebellious behavior. Movies like Rebel Without a Cause, 1955, showed this fear. Teenagers were seen as a new unpredictable force. Rock and roll, and Elvis specifically, quickly became linked to this fear. Critics said the music was wild. It was unruly, it encouraged lawlessness. They believed it stripped young people of their inhibitions. It made them uncontrollable. Newspapers often ran stories that connected rock and roll concerts to riots or disturbances. While these incidents were often exaggerated, they fueled the narrative. People feared that listening to Elvis would make their kids bad, that it would make them reject authority, that it would lead them to crime. Dr. Wortham's earlier work on comic books, already mentioned, laid the groundwork. He argued that popular culture could corrupt youth. This idea was easily transferred to rock and roll. Law enforcement officials sometimes blamed rock and roll for specific incidents of youthful misbehavior. They often lacked concrete evidence, but the narrative was powerful. It provided a simple explanation for a complex social problem. It gave adults a clear target for their anxieties about youth. It made Elvis the poster child for everything that was wrong with the new generation. Was rock and roll truly causing delinquency, or just offering a soundtrack to existing social problems? If Elvis had sung gospel music, would juvenile delinquency still have been blamed on him? And what does it say about society when it always looks to blame external influences for its children's behavior? Number 8. Did Elvis challenge what it meant to be a man or a woman? The 1950s had very strict gender roles. Men were strong, silent, providers, while women were homemakers, nurturers, submissive. Elvis messed with these ideas. For young men, he was both tough and vulnerable. He wore flashy clothes, he had a sexy swagger, and he was confident, but he also had a dreamy quality, a sensitivity. This was confusing to some. It wasn't the traditional image of masculinity. He wasn't a cowboy. He wasn't a stoic family man. He was something new, something a bit flamboyant. For young women, Elvis was a revelation. He was openly sensual. He made them feel things that were not discussed. He gave them permission to be excited, to scream, to express their desires openly. This challenged the idea of the demure, passive woman. It suggested women had their own sexual agency, their own desires, and that was very threatening. Traditionalists saw his influence as feminizing men. or making women too bold, too unladylike. Frank Sinatra, a huge star from an earlier generation, was openly critical of rock and roll. He called it a rancid-smelling aphrodisiac. He saw it as a threat to true artistry, and perhaps to traditional masculinity itself. The Panic wasn't just about music. It was about how Elvis blurred lines, how he challenged deeply ingrained ideas about what it meant to be a man, and what it meant to be a woman. He opened up new ways for young people to express their gender, and that was a big deal. Did Elvis's gender bending actually pave the way for more fluid expressions of identity, or did it just highlight existing anxieties? If Elvis had been less conventionally attractive, would the gender panic have been as intense? And what does it mean that society often polices gender expression through attacks on popular culture? Number 7. How did the teenager become a new cultural battlefield? Before the 1950s, the idea of a distinct teenager was still quite new. Kids went from childhood straight to adult responsibilities. But after the war, things changed. There was more disposable income, more free time. A whole new demographic emerged. The teenager, they had their own slang, their own clothes, and crucially, their own money. They were a powerful consumer group, and they chose Elvis. This was a problem for adults, because teenagers had their own culture separate from their parents. They listened to different music, they read different magazines, they watched different movies. This created a new kind of generation gap, a gap that was economic as well as cultural. Life magazine ran articles about youth culture in the 1950s. They documented the rise of this new group. They tried to understand it, but they also reflected adult unease. Parents worried about this new independence. They saw it as rebellion, they saw it as a rejection of their values. Elvis was the king of this new teenage kingdom. He validated their feelings, he spoke their language, he gave them a voice. This made him a target. He was a symbol of youth autonomy, of a generation breaking away. And that autonomy was scary to many adults. It was a loss of control, a sign that the old order was changing. Did the concept of the teenager create the moral panic, or did the panic simply highlight the emergence of this new demographic? If teenagers hadn't had their own money, would the cultural impact of Elvis have been the same? And what new teenager panics are we unknowingly creating for the next generation? Number 6. What happens when the fans fight back against the haters? Not everyone bought into the moral panic, not by a long shot. Millions of teenagers, mostly girls, loved Elvis. They adored him, they defended him, they saw him as their hero. They didn't see him as vulgar or dangerous. They saw him as exciting, as real. They wrote letters to magazines and newspapers. They told off the critics, they told off their parents, they formed fan clubs. They bought his records, they went to his concerts, they screamed their heads off. Their loyalty was fierce. This counter-reaction was important. It showed that the moral panic wasn't universally accepted. It was a generational battle. The fans' support was a direct challenge to adult authority. It said, "We like what we like, and you can't stop us." This made the panic even more intense for adults, because their efforts to control were failing. Their children weren't listening. The more adults condemned Elvis, the more some teenagers dug in their heels. They saw it as adults simply not understanding, or being old-fashioned. This created a deeper wedge between the generations. The fans' unwavering support showed the power of youth culture. It showed that teenagers were not just passive recipients of adult values. They had their own voice, their own choices, and they were willing to fight for them. Did the fans' unwavering loyalty truly strengthen Elvis's position, or did it just fuel adult resentment? If Elvis had told his fans to calm down, would they have listened, or would they have felt betrayed? And what current cultural battles show a similar dynamic between passionate fans and disapproving critics? Number 5, how did the pelvis get tamed for television? Elvis's early television appearances were electric and controversial. His appearance on the Milton Berle Show in June 1956 showed his full, wild energy. His hip gyrations during Hound Dog caused a massive public outcry. Adults were scandalized. Critics called him lewd, crude, a corrupting influence. The public reaction was so strong that other shows took notice. When Elvis was booked for the Ed Sullivan Show, the producers faced a dilemma. Sullivan's show was seen as wholesome, family-friendly. They couldn't have Elvis doing that. So, they made a decision. For his third appearance in January 1957, Elvis would be shown only from the waist up. This was a clear act of censorship. It was an attempt to control his image, to make him acceptable for a wider, more conservative audience. The producers hoped it would appease the moral watchdogs. And it did to some extent. It signaled that Elvis was being cleaned up, but it also highlighted the very thing they were trying to hide. It drew attention to his body, to his controversial movements. It became a famous moment in television history, a symbol of the moral panic itself. It showed how powerful public pressure could be, and how the media tried to navigate the divide between youth rebellion and adult fear. It was a clear win for the forces of traditional morality, at least for that moment. Did censoring Elvis's movements actually make him more intriguing, or did it genuinely calm the panic? If Ed Sullivan had embraced Elvis's full performance, how would history remember that moment? And what are we still censoring today, believing it makes things safer, but actually drawing more attention to them? Number 4, what did Elvis reveal about America's own deepest contradictions? The moral panic around Elvis in the 1950s wasn't just about a singer, it was about America itself. It revealed deep contradictions. On one hand, America presented itself as a land of freedom, of individualism, of self-expression. But on the other hand, it demanded conformity. Especially from its youth, it valued tradition, it valued stability. Elvis challenged this. He was a product of American culture, he was from the South. He sang music that was deeply American, but he twisted it. He made it new, and that was threatening. America was also grappling with race. It was supposedly a land of equality, but segregation was rampant. Elvis brought black music to white audiences. He forced a confrontation with this racial divide. He made white teenagers connect with a culture many adults considered other. This highlighted the hypocrisy of a nation that preached freedom but practiced discrimination. The panic also showed a contradiction in how America viewed success. Elvis was a rags to riches story, the American dream personified. But his success came from something that many deemed immoral. It showed that the path to success wasn't always clean. It wasn't always traditional. It could be wild, it could be sexual, it could be rebellious. This was unsettling. The panic was a symptom of a nation struggling with its identity, struggling with change, and struggling to reconcile its ideals with its realities. Did America consciously ignore its own contradictions before Elvis, or did he simply make them impossible to ignore? If Elvis had been clean cut from the start, would different American contradictions have come to light? And how do we still manage to hold conflicting beliefs about freedom and control in our society today? Number 3, how did Elvis himself deal with being a national scapegoat? Elvis Presley was a young man thrust into an unprecedented level of fame and controversy. He was only 21 when the moral panic reached its peak. How did he cope? He often remained outwardly polite. He often deferred to authority figures. He never explicitly told his fans to defy their parents. He often tried to explain his actions. He said he was just expressing himself, that his movements were natural, that he wasn't trying to be vulgar. For example, in interviews, he'd say things like, "I just enjoy what I'm doing," or "I don't do anything that I feel is wrong." But he also made compromises. The Ed Sullivan waist-up performance was a forced compromise. He went into the Army in 1958. This was seen by many as a way to clean up his image, to make him more respectable. It was a strategic move by his manager, Colonel Tom Parker. It worked. His time in the military was praised by the media and parents. It showed he was a good American boy, after all. But this period of intense scrutiny must have been incredibly stressful. He was under constant pressure to perform, to behave, to be an icon, but also to be a good role model. It shaped his career. It shaped his public persona. He never quite returned to the raw, untamed energy of his earliest performances. The panic had tamed him, at least on the surface, but the internal struggle must have been immense. He was living under a microscope. Did Elvis truly understand the depth of the panic, or was he just reacting to the pressures around him? If he had openly defied the moral critics, would his career have survived? And how much of a performer's true self is lost when they are forced to conform to public expectations? Number 2, what lasting scars did the Elvis panic leave on music and youth culture? The moral panic surrounding Elvis had a huge impact. It didn't stop rock and roll. In fact, in some ways, it strengthened it. It proved that youth culture was a powerful force, a force that could not be easily suppressed. but it did leave scars. It set a precedent for future moral panics. Every new music genre after rock and roll faced similar accusations. Jazz, disco, hell, heavy metal, rap, they all went through their own versions of moral outrage. They were called dangerous. They were blamed for societal ills. The Elvis panic showed that popular music could be a battleground, a place where generations fought for control. It also forced artists and the music industry to become more aware of censorship, of public scrutiny. It showed that what was acceptable on stage might not be acceptable on TV or in homes. It solidified the idea of a generation gap. It made it clear that teenagers had their own distinct culture, a culture that parents often didn't understand and didn't approve of. This gap continued to widen throughout the 60s and beyond. The panic also showed the power of collective fear, how easily a society can target a symbol, and how quickly that symbol can become a lightning rod for all its anxieties. It shaped how future stars were managed, how they presented themselves, how they navigated controversy. It made it clear that fame came with a heavy price, the price of constant judgment. Actually make youth culture stronger by giving it a common enemy, or did it just teach it to be more cautious? If rock and roll had never faced such strong opposition, would it have evolved differently? And what lessons from the Elvis panic do we still fail to learn when new cultural phenomena emerge today? Number one, why does the ghost of Elvis still haunt our moral panics today? The moral panic around Elvis happened more than 60 years ago, but its echo is still with us. Why? Because the underlying fears haven't gone away. We still fear change. We still fear what's new. We still fear our children growing up and becoming different from us. We still fear things that challenge traditional values. Every new generation, every new technology, every new cultural trend faces similar scrutiny. Video games, social media, TikTok, AI, each one sparks conversations, debates, and sometimes panics. Just like Elvis, people worry about mental health, about addiction, about the erosion of social skills, about sexual content. These are the modern versions of juvenile delinquency and promiscuity. The Elvis panic showed us how society projects its anxieties onto popular culture. It showed how we demonize what we don't understand or what we can't control. It showed us that moral panics are rarely about the thing itself. They are about the deeper fears of the people experiencing the panic, about their own insecurities, about their own sense of a changing world, and Elvis was just a convenient target, a powerful symbol. He opened a door to understanding how we react to the unfamiliar, how we try to protect ourselves from the future, and how, despite all our progress, we still struggle with the same basic human fears. The fear of losing control, the fear of the unknown, the fear of our own desires, and the fear of our children's freedom. Are we destined to repeat moral panics with every new generation, or can we truly learn from history? What new Elvis is emerging right now that we are collectively condemning without truly understanding? And how much of our current moral outrage is genuinely about protecting others, and how much is about our own discomfort with societal evolution?